Our next presenter is William Kowalski. William Kowalski is co-founder and chief operating officer of Atomos Space. Did I say it right?
Yep, that's right.
That was a lucky guess. He runs the company's day-to-day business, market analysis, and regulatory strategy. Take it away.
Okay. Is this on? Yeah. So our presentation is going to be a little different than I would say some of the other ones, but we do agree with everything that has been said. So I'm going to try not to repeat a lot of things. But mainly that's because Atomos isn't, we wouldn't consider ourselves a nuclear company. We use nuclear technology for what we want to do. And the idea for the company was originally born out of nuclear technology. Does this work? Or
No, because it's a PDF. So.
Okay, so next slide. So when we usually present the company and first talk about it, we say rockets were originally created for military use with little thought for cost. This is largely because when you go to space, you need propellant to get up there, and the further you want to go, the more propellant you need, and the more propellant you need to carry that propellant. So this is why we had this big discussion on, 100 kilograms, 600, 800 additional mass for a long distance mission starts to really add up. It's a rather exponential relationship between cost and mass. So this is for the Delta IV Heavy, a cost per kilogram graph. I chose this one here because it's the only vehicle currently operating that can do a large mission to a direct geo insertion, geostationary Earth orbit. Next slide. But this chart, so some more common vehicles that we see today, this is just scaled for that direct geo based on propellant usage for the satellite itself doing a GTO, a transfer orbit.
You can't see the screen.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Doing a GTO to geo transfer on its own. Next slide. So this is Atomos's business model. We are trying to break the space transportation segment into two parts. Let rockets do what they do best, get cargo into orbit, a minimum orbit, and then we would rendezvous with them and take them to their final destination. Really help change that rocket equation paradigm. Next slide. To do that, we are using electric propulsion because it is much more efficient than chemical systems. Now, with electric propulsion, while you have very high efficiency, the trade-off is you have rather low thrust. So when you want to go fairly far, it can start to take a significant amount of time to get there. To offset that, you need to increase power levels. So this is a graph of a propulsion system we would use for a solar electric vehicle. As you can see, the issue with solar is that power level and mass have a linear relationship. As you start to add solar power panels to increase your power, your mass increases in tandem. So now you start consuming more and more propellant to get up to that speed. So there's somewhat of a limit on how fast you can make the vehicle with solar. To overcome this, you need higher energy densities, which is why we want to move towards a nuclear electric system. So as you can see, operating at a 500 kilowatt range with a nuclear system, we can take that 6-month LEO to GEO transfer down to a little over 2 months. Next slide. So the original concept of our system used HEU. And as you can see, operating at a lower power level, so 10 kilowatts, the additional mass does add up. So between an LEU and an HEU system, that LEO to GEO transfer, it adds another 3 months of duration. However, the graph itself is a little misleading because it only starts at 28 months. And for us, that is not a viable business model moving from low Earth orbit to geostationary in over 30 months. So this is also why we don't operate in the regimes of low power nuclear systems. For us, it only starts to make sense when we're in the hundreds to low megawatt level of power. Next slide. So when we start operating at those higher power levels, you can see that mass difference has a very minimal impact on the duration difference in that transfer. And this is largely because of all the things that were mentioned before. As you increase the power level, what things are really driving you are shielding, conversion systems, and for us, the propellants stored on the spacecraft itself. So Atomos is a venture-backed startup. We spoke to well over 200 investors trying to get off the grounds, and without fail, the #1 reason we were politely and sometimes not politely told no was for regulatory reasons. A lot of people said, well, it'll be very challenging for a commercial company to launch a nuclear system. With the presidential memorandum that came out, this really helps move us forward. It created a lot more interest from investors in talking to us. However, that also is another reason why we would not want to go to a highly enriched system. So when you're raising private capital for us, it's all about burning down risk for the next investor. How are we going to take the money that we have now, do a few things, mitigate the likelihood that they're going to lose their money, and we can get to a point where we are making a profit. We see HEU as something that's very hard to burn down risk on. There's a lot of things that are out of our control. It's a very politically volatile type of fuel. As was mentioned before, internationally and in Congress, it would not take a lot to create a mandate that no commercial entity could use an HEU system. And if we had raised $100 million of private investments, we haven't raised that yet, to build a system, and all of a sudden Congress said, nope, this isn't going to happen, you're not allowed to get this fuel, then what do we do? This is why we don't want to go in that direction. I want to end on this slide too. So if you've seen this before, you know what it is. On the right-hand side is Elon Musk's Roadster that was put into a Falcon Heavy fairing that was launched into a helio-Martian orbit. And on the left is the same fairing on a Falcon 9. So this is 60 Starlink satellites flat stacked for that first launch they did of putting their constellation into orbit. So the one on the left, why I bring that up, is that represents roughly 13.6 metric tons of mass. This was launched to an altitude of 440 kilometers. The Falcon 9 to that orbit has a launch capacity of a little over 15,000 metric tons. So that means about 1.6 metric tons of extra mass capacity was going into orbits. As you can see, it's fairly tight in that fairing. There's not a lot of room left to add more mass. And this is starting to become the real issue with a lot of launches. It's not always a mass constraint. A lot of times with launch, there's a volumetric constraint that you can't just fit everything into the fairing, which is another reason why we see less of an issue with having a few 800, 600 more kilograms for the reactor itself. There's a lot of wiggle room in the mass budget of launch vehicles. And particularly when you're going to that low orbit, which is where Atomos sees ourselves as coming in and helping. Because while those longer missions, those scientific missions, that difference starts to really add up. That's because, in our view, we've been putting stuff into space the wrong way, sending everything from the ground out in a rocket. The most efficient way is to put things in the rocket, get it to orbit, and then use another system to push it out, really mitigating the overall impact of using a slightly heavier fuel for your reactor. And that's it.
Great, thank you very much. We now know what a nuclear tug is.